So many are calling this moment a civilizational crisis. Maybe you've heard that in the news feeds. Maybe you've seen the headlines. Maybe you're experiencing even anxiety as you think about everything that's circling in our world. Historians are talking about this moment as a crisis. Some of you, maybe you've read The Fourth Turning is Here by Neil Stowe, a historian who actually looks at the 80-year cycles by which we've actually seen crisis take place over the last 500 years in American history. When they go back 80 years, it's World War II. When they go 80 years before that, it's the Civil War. 80 years before that, the American Revolution. And they point to this moment, to these years, as another cycle in history where there will be more and more crisis than perhaps we've experienced in the last 80 years. Now, that may not be news to you because you hear about it every day, whether it's a future pandemic that people are talking about, whether it's climate change, whether it's overpopulation, whether it's an economic crash or crisis, whether it's war and rumors of war. It never seems to stop. And I want to submit to you that part of the crisis and part of the ways in which crisis is used to actually demoralize you is a product of the way the enemy wants to work in your generation. He wants you to feel anxiety. He wants you to be afraid. He wants you to actually experience fear. But I want to remind you of how Jesus told us to think about moments like this. When you look at Matthew 24, there's a conversation about what will the end times look like. And you don't have to go far to hear Christians talk about the end times and perhaps to imagine that we're living into this moment. But you don't even need to believe that to recognize even historically that the moment we're in, Jesus is referencing, because as he references this, we can look throughout all of history and see these moments happen. And here's what he says. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed. See that you're not alarmed. See that you are not afraid. These things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and it goes on and on and on. And Jesus' message at that moment to the disciples was, no matter what generation you're in, you're going to hear about these things. Do not be afraid. And we know hundreds of times throughout Scripture, this is the message. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. How is it possible? How is it possible to hear about all of this, constantly be fed it in our news feeds, constantly hear friends worried about things and talking about it, and how is it possible that you would not be afraid? How would you not feel fear? You see, the enemy wants to use two things to keep you in fear that I believe Christ wants us to overcome. The first one is identity. You see, you're afraid when you don't know the position that you hold of authority in the midst of any kind of crisis or dynamic. And so the enemy wants to create so much confusion around your identity and who you are and whose you are. He wants you to feel lonely, isolated. He wants you to experience feelings of not having enough information or control over the future so that it actually leaves you feeling helpless. But we know in 2 Peter 2:9 that we are a royal priesthood, a chosen people. That we are people that live under a kingdom and under a king. And when we recognize the authority he wants us to walk in, we start to act differently. We start to treat the enemy differently. We start to put the oppressor and the demons and the spiritual warfare that we experience, we put it in its proper corner, don't we? We don't just walk around letting it tell us how we're going to live and how we're going to feel. We actually walk in authority because we know whose we are. But the second area that the enemy wants to tempt you in this moment is ideologies. He wants you to subscribe to an ideology. He wants you to just pick one, but he wants you to pick something different than the Christian faith. Perhaps for you it's conservatism. Maybe it's liberalism. Maybe it's socialism. You see, there's ideologies constantly being paraded in front of you of ways in which you can make sense of the world. And if you'll just buy into one of those ideologies, you'll feel more confident, secure. You'll know the future. You'll know how to work towards the peace of the world. And yet as Christians, we actually aren't called to just ascribe to some ideology. We are called to recognize that we are part of a kingdom. And that the way in which a Christian walks forward in this world is they call Christ Christ. But you know, in this age, we've been warned so many times in the New Testament that there will be those who try to pull you away through false teaching, through false doctrines. In fact, Colossians tells us about it, 2:8. Be careful that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit based on human tradition, based on the elemental forces of the world, and not based on Christ. You see, there's a warning here that Paul does through most of his letters. He's constantly warning the church about false teaching, about the ways in which people will take portions of the truth, add a little bit to it, add a little human tradition to it, and try to tempt you away so that you'll actually believe something that's not 100% true. And that's all the enemy needs. He needs us to just buy in just a little bit to a lie, to a falsehood that we would then found our life on. And in doing so, we would actually start to live out our faith in such a way that we miss the power and the authority that Christ wants us to walk in. But you see, when we recognize that this is not an ideology we're supposed to subscribe to, but that we're part of a kingdom, and you know how kingdoms work, right? Kingdoms take authority. They, as citizens of the kingdom, when they walk forward with the authority of the king, they walk forward in confidence. They're the types of disciples who Jesus actually declares when they go out, they will heal. They will cast out demons. They will heal the sick because they know under whose authority they operate in. And so in this generation, as crisis continues to be thrust upon you, as more and more people start to be afraid about the times, about what's taking place in the world, you are going to have an incredible opportunity with your friends and your peers to be one that walks forward in confidence. Confidence that you first know your identity, you know who you are, you know whose you are, you can trust in him, you can trust when he says, do not be afraid, do not fear. That when you're actually being afraid, when you are in fear, that there's a part of your faith that he wants to strengthen. And he wants you to recognize that you don't need to know the future, you don't need to understand how all of these plans are going to work out, about what my Father's up to. What you need to know is you can have confidence in me that I am with you, that I go before you, that I'm at work in this world, that I want to work right in the place that I've called you to show up and the relationships that I've given to you. But you can only do that when you know whose you are. You see, when we make Jesus Lord of our life, when we actually submit into his authority, he's going to call us into all kinds of crazy things. All kinds of wild places, new cities, new places you never thought at this age he was going to call you into. And it's the most magnificent journey of your life. You just keep saying yes after yes after yes. You just keep obeying because you don't know what the outcome's going to be, but you know you can trust your Father who's designed you, who knit you in your mother's womb, who's declared over you life, and that you would be someone who brings life to everyone that you encounter. And when you walk forward in your generation with that kind of confidence, I would submit to you, you're not going to be a crisis generation, you're going to be the Christ generation. You're going to be the Christ generation that shows up in a longing world, a world that says, I need better answers. The ideologies I bought into, the ways people are telling me to live, the pursuits, the idolatry that they've asked me to pursue, it's not working out. It's failing. I'm suffering. I need a better answer. And when you walk forward and you offer Christ instead of crisis, you become a healer. You become a hope giver. And you become a peacemaker so that no one is afraid. Thank you.